So today we're going to learn how to write a bunch of TypeScript helpers, also called utility types. So if you head over to the TypeScript website and go to the utility type section, you can see some of the ones that are built in. So we've got awaited, partial, that's super common, read only, record, pick and omit. These are super popular as well. So just to give a little refresher on what something like omit would do, if we had a type called user, for example, we could also just make this an interface. And what if we wanted a version of the user without the age? We could say incomplete user equals omit user without, let's say, age in this case. So there we have user with just the ID and name, age has been omitted. We could also use something like partial to make all the fields optional. So here we have the same user, but we've got a question mark next to all the fields indicating that they are now optional. And as you're writing TypeScript code, you'll just get general use cases for all of these different kind of built-in helpers. Obviously, the more popular ones are built in, but quickly you'll get to a point where you need to write some of your own. And I think it's really important to understand how they work internally so that when you do get to that point, you can just write them quite easily. So for the first example, we'll write our own helper called deep partial. So looking at this example again, we've got the incomplete user with the ID, name and age as optional. But if I add an address object with city and country, and I look at the user again, you can see that the top level fields are optional, but the fields nested within address are not. So partial only works on top level fields, and if you want to access objects recursively, you need to write your own method for that. So we can write one called deep partial. So the way you define a helper is just like you would any regular type. You just use the word type. We'll call it deep partial. And you can think of these as working like functions. So this is where the arguments would be passed in. In TypeScript's case, that those are just generics. So our generic is going to be called T, which is a common pattern. And we're going to return something. So in this case, for now, let's do an empty object. So let's pass user into deep partial and see what we get. So we've got the object back. That's expected. Now we can start to actually implement the type. So we'll be using a bunch of patterns to implement this type. Things like the key of operator, conditional types and generics. If you're not familiar with those, there is a link to another video in the description and I'll just pop it up on screen now if you're on desktop, and that will give you a detailed refresher of how all of these work. But for now, I'll just assume that you're familiar with these patterns. So inside deep partial, we want to map over every single key of user and say that it should be optional. So let's define key as K. So K in key of T. And then we can just say, for now, let's return TK. So this will pretty much do nothing at the moment. It returns the object as is. We could make all of the fields optional by just saying, make them optional with a question mark. Now all the fields are optional, but again, city and country still aren't. So we need to use some conditional types to say, if we get to an object, let's pass that object back into our helper and return its type. Otherwise, just continue as we are. So rather than say the key of T here, we can say key of T extends object. If it does, we'll call deep partial again, passing in the object. Otherwise, return key of T like we did before. So that means that we're going to loop around each of these keys. In our case, it's user. We have ID, which is not an object. So we just return key of T. Same for name, same for age. But then when we hit address, its type is an object. So rather than returning the type here, we return the type here, which passes key of T in, so this object, back into deep partial, which will loop over then city and country and make those fields optional as well. So incomplete user now has question marks on all of these, and you can see deep partial has been wrapped around address as well. So if I define a new object with this type, you can see now that I can just pass some of the fields to address. I don't need to specify country, and an error won't throw. If I just put this back to partial again, you'll see that we get an error saying that the country is expected. So if you start to get more familiar with generics, key of operator and conditional types, you'll be able to write a ton of different helpers. And you pretty much just follow these same kind of patterns to write very complex types. So imagine we want to get all the keys of an object. So we could say type keys is equal to an array, and each value must be a key of our user. So this means we need an array and the values can only be one of the keys specified here. So if I create that array, apply the type, we've got ID, name, address. If we're trying to add anything that's not valid, we'll get a type error for that. But what if we only want to get the keys that are strings, for example? We could create a new helper called key of type. So again, we say type, key of type, and this time we're going to pass in two generics, the object we're working with and the type we actually want to pick. So T being the object, and then we'll use U for the actual type. These kind of single letter patterns are just quite common in TypeScript, but you can pass literally any value in. I could actually pass the word obj here if I wanted, and type if I wanted, like that. But for now, I'll just stick to T and U. So here we're going to follow a super similar pattern as we did with deep partials. So we're going to say K again in key of T. So we're going to loop over all the keys again. And let's just, for now, just return the actual key. And I'll just type out below an example of using this helper so we can see how it changes over time. So we'll have type keys equals key of type. We'll pass in our user object, and we're saying this time we only want to pick strings. I'll just delete this one for now. So for now, this is just going to return the same object as we passed in, because that's all we're doing. And again, following the patterns of deep partial, we can use conditional types. But this time we want to check the type of U. In this case, it would be a string. So we say if the property we're on extends U, then return the actual key, otherwise return never. And now what this will give us is the same object, but where the type didn't match, we return never, and when the type did match, we return the actual value. But we actually want to get an array, not an object like this. So to do that, we just use array syntax. We say key of T at the end again. And now keys can only be name, because name is the only string value. I could say like other value and make that a string as well. And now keys can either be name or other value. So you can see that with two completely different helpers here, we're following very, very similar patterns. We're using the key of operator, we're using conditional types, and we're also using generics. So get familiar with these and you can write very complex helpers quite easily. If you like this video, please leave a comment and I will see you in the next one.